Teraz nás čaká ďalší veľmi zaujímavý bod v našom programe Francesca Panetta. To znie veľmi taliansky, ale je to Britka, ktorá píše pre The Guardian, veľké európske noviny, dôležité noviny, určite čítané aj na Slovensku. A Francesca pre Guardian píše o virtuálnej realite a zvlášť sa venuje jednému svojmu veľkému projektu 6x9, kde sa s tímom pokúsila vytvoriť dokonalú virtuálnu verziu väzenskej samotky, väzenskej cely a toho, čo človek by mohol aspoň teda virtuálne si živo predstaviť, aké to je byť v takejto cele zavretý. A tento projekt vzbudil medzinárodne veľký ohlas. Dokonca sa dostal na takú každoročnú prehliadku umenia a tvorivosti do Bieleho domu vo Washingtone. Je to teda medzinárodne oceňovaná umelkyňa a novinárka. Práve nám porozpráva o zaujímavú tému, ako sa dá virtuálna realita, téma, ktorá čoraz viac zamestnáva ľudí v technologickom svete, premietnúť do novinárčiny, do žurnalistiky. Takže Francesca Panetta, poprosím vás, please come, the floor is yours. Poprosím vás aj o potlesk pre ňu za to, že k nám prišla. Je to veľmi zaneprázdnená osoba. A opäť pripomínam, 40-minútová prezentácia a potom 10 minutes for the Q&A. A samozrejme môžete zase posielať otázky na ňu cez slajdov. Pripojte sa. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. And I am executive editor of virtual reality at The Guardian, and I'm going to talk today about turning journalism into virtual reality, which has now become my job after being at The Guardian for 10 years. This is what I've found myself doing. We're going to run through, first of all, hype and reality. That's a question that's often asked to me. Is virtual reality just all hype? I'm going to die as it did before. In the 80s. What actually is virtual reality, a little bit about the terminology, history of it within journalism, but then looking at storytelling and some of the pieces we've been doing at The Guardian, the learnings we've come across and also some of the difficulties as well. So we'll start off with the hype. This is a quote from Roy Amara, who was a futurist at Stanford University. He said, "We tend to overestimate the effects of technology in the short term and underestimate them in the long run." And certainly we are here at the beginning of the hype cycle here, and I'm sure there is going to be a dip as we do face reality. But I mean, my belief is that we will end up coming to a sustainable market, because I believe there's a kind of real potential in the form, and I'll go on to talk a little bit about why I believe that. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the terminology of VR, because often the word VR is used for different formats. At the moment, we see VR really in two forms. One is console form, which is usually attached to PCs, quite expensive headsets, Oculus Rift, HTC Vive. You can usually interact more, better visual fidelity for these console based. But more and more we're seeing these mobile headsets, which places your smartphone into essentially a plastic case, and means that you can basically have VR with your own hardware that you've already got. There are also two types of VR being made at the moment, one being kind of true VR. So this is a terminology that's used by quite a lot of purists, where a virtual world is actually created and you can interact and be part of that world. And another is 360 video. This is actually the camera rig that we've got at The Guardian, and you film on 16 GoPro cameras. The films are stitched together to give you a spherical video. That isn't interactive, and purists will say this actually isn't virtual reality. I guess for me, it's more about whether you are immersed in a 360 world, visually and also sonically. So even if it's in one of these Google Cardboard headsets, by using these headsets, you can really immerse yourself, compared to, I think, what you've probably seen on screens, which is 360 video, where you can scroll around, or you can use kind of your phones in magic window mode. I mean, they're actually called 360 video as well, but in my opinion, that's not a virtual world. You're not being transported to another place. So I guess for the intents and purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking about virtual reality as if you're watching something in a headset and feel like you're in another place. Virtual reality is developing in a number of different places at the moment. So the gamers obviously were first to this and have done a lot of the legwork for us in terms of developing what virtual reality is. But we're also seeing it being used in shopping and retail. It's obviously a useful device for live events, whether they're music gigs, opera, or sports events. To feel like you're in the front row of any of these places is, you know, a useful device for the organizations that want to get a larger reach. For education, Google is got a whole program called Expeditions, where it's trying to take cardboard headsets into schools to be using virtual reality in teaching. I'd say healthcare is probably one of the most innovative areas in terms of virtual reality. It's being used by surgeons to try and teach how to perform surgery for medical students. It's also being used as a therapeutic device. So for people who suffer from phantom limb syndrome, from PTSD. I've heard of cases of nurses using it for people with burns who have put them into kind of polar environments where actually feeling like they're in extremely cold situations actually alleviates the pain. And I'm going to talk specifically about its use in journalism. Really, I would say the second wave of VR, so VR 2.0 as we call it, was started by Noni de la Peña. Wonderful to have a woman pioneering virtual reality this time around. She runs Emblematic Group, and in 2012 she launched a piece with Palmer Luckey as her intern called Hunger in LA. And this was a reconstruction of a food bank queue in LA where a man in the line collapsed from having a diabetic attack. So she took the audio from that scene and rebuilt, using animation, the environment with you in that environment. And she's gone on to use that technique several times, taking the audio from real life events and then reconstructing the world to mean that you can be in that. She did a piece in Syria with a bomb which happens very near to you. She has also done a piece where you cross an abortion line picket, and a piece on domestic violence as well. Really, the New York Times had a real milestone in terms of where VR has been developing within journalism a year ago. It launched its app, New York Times VR, and posted out 1.3 million cardboard headsets to all of its subscribers. And since then, it's had 1 million downloads of its VR app and says it's making a profit from VR. Other groups that are making journalism VR are Huffington Post, who bought Riot, which is a production company who makes VR. LA Times has been making pieces. Frontline, ABC, and a couple of UK organisations as well. FT has been trying. So different organisations to different extents are trying to see what VR and journalism can mean, and actually very different interpretations as well. I'm going to tell you specifically about the storytelling potential that I feel this has and some of the work that we've been doing. 6x9 was a piece that I launched in April. I've been working in the field of innovation in journalism for about the last 5 years at The Guardian. Before doing VR, I was doing interactive documentary making, looking at different forms of combining different ways of storytelling, mainly in interactives. And I could see that there was a potential with virtual reality and journalism, and wanted to do a kind of proof of concept to see whether The Guardian was interested in this as a form. It's not a new topic to The Guardian. Ed Pilkington, our chief reporter in New York, has been covering this for years, specifically the case of the Angola 3. This is Albert Woodfox. The last of the 3 was released earlier this year after spending 43 years in solitary confinement. There are still about 100,000 people who are currently in solitary confinement in the US. That means being in a cell for up to 23 hours a day. Your food's delivered through a slot, your toilet is in the same room as you, and it's on average about 6 feet by 9 feet in dimensions. You can be put into solitary confinement for relatively minor offences, for swearing at a prison official, for being caught with alcohol or drugs on you. And once you're in solitary confinement, it can be easy to rack up more time in there. Anything you do that does not comply with regulations can earn you another 3 months in there. And people can go in for a relatively small offence and end up there for years. I interviewed 7 people who had experienced solitary confinement in both New York and in California, and I used their voices and also worked with them making this piece 6x9, and also consulted with 2 psychologists who've been looking specifically at the mental harm that can happen from being in isolation. Sensory deprivation can cause all kinds of symptoms. So when you don't see anyone or speak to anyone, the mind begins to fill in those gaps. So you begin to hear voices, you begin to see people in your cell, and I worked with them on what the research they'd had on was, but also talked to the people in New York and in California about their specific experiences of being in solitary confinement and how that affected them mentally. I'll just play you a little trailer to give you a bit of a taster of what the project ended up like. Oh, can we have sound? I'll go back. Is it possible to put the... It's not possible to...
You were going to undergo many different kinds of reactions, and some of them will be more...
It's all right. It's not possible to plug the sound into the output.
Welcome to your cell. You're going to be here for 23 hours a day.
You were going to undergo many different kinds of reactions, and some of them will be more immediate than others.
Keep your eye on survival. Memorize your space. After a while, things start to slip. I find myself floating. The toilet that drips. People turn on themselves. It's almost like you want to feel alive. You do something to make them notice you. So, now that you're here, what are you going to do? What can you do?
Okay, well, I don't know if you could hear any of that, but you maybe got a sense from the visuals. Oh, let's go back. So you might have noticed that we built the cell in 6x9 in CGI. And there was a couple of reasons for that. It was difficult to get access to a supermax prison in the States in the time that we had. But also it would have been difficult to do exactly what we wanted, to have the flexibility to film it as we wanted, to have food arrive at the time we wanted. Similarly, it would have been difficult to have the flexibility in building the project. It took us 9 months from beginning to end to make this. And all the time we were changing the storyline, trying to figure out what the flow of events should be, the pacing of it, at what stage someone would walk past the window, at what stage you would experience some of the hallucinations and experiences that the people who I interviewed described to me. So by building it in a game engine, we had kind of flexibility right up to the end. more importantly than that, it meant that you could actually interact with the project. So as I think I explained at the beginning, that if you build something in a game engine, you actually then have ultimate flexibility to be in that world. You can you can do whatever you want within a coder's capabilities. So it meant that it had the potential to give more agency to an audience member. We started off by going through the interviews that I did and cutting the audio testimony from them. And I had a very specific technique that I used when making 6x9, where I asked the people that I interviewed to talk to me as if I was in solitary confinement, because I wanted it to feel like you were currently in solitary confinement. And I'll speak a little bit more about perspectives later on. But we went through all of the audio testimonies and cut the narrative. Then when creating the CGI experience, we were really keen for it to be a really solid piece of journalism. Now, creating a fake cell, which is what it is in CGI, we really wanted it to be as solid a piece of journalism as anything else we do in The Guardian. So all details we went through. So the books that were in the cell were specifically the books of the people that I interviewed for the piece. I worked with them throughout the project, checking all the specific details. So when we were trying to figure out how to arrange things in the cell, I would send them stills, and we would talk about it. So this was 5 who wrote back to me. There wouldn't be an entire roll of toilet roll. In fact, they never had they don't have cardboard inside the insides of the toilet roll. And we had too many clothes here. You can see you've got 3 sets of clothes. You'd only have 1 set. And the toothbrushes are made out of cardboard. They're never made out of plastic because they think they can then be used as weapons. And 5 also said he thought that this blanket was too large. So we went back and forth with these prototypes, working with both Solitary Watch and the people who gave us their testimonies. There is also there's a nighttime scene which represents the memories that really haunt the people who are in solitary confinement. As you can imagine, you spend a lot of time digging over past memories and reminiscing. And Johnny, who was one of the younger members of the people that I interviewed, sent me his own footage to include, which we projected on the wall to represent the memories of the things that he would be thinking about while he was in solitary confinement for the 1.5 years that he was there. We launched the project in April, and it was available for both iOS and for Android. We released it for Oculus Gear VR and also for Cardboard. But we also released a whole load of surrounding content as well. I think one of the things that we felt we could bring as The Guardian would be not only a very kind of powerful experiential piece, but also a lot of other information as well, and made in the form that was most appropriate. So we had a fact sheet that was just a written FAQ about solitary confinement, but we also included podcasts of all of the 7 people about their personal experience and their personal testimonies. We also had a video about families who are trying to cope with their loved ones who are currently in solitary confinement. So and news stories. I mean, I commissioned about 15 pieces to go alongside this virtual reality piece, and the idea was not only to support the VR piece, but also to provide a way of driving people to the experience and vice versa back once you'd seen the experience, to give more context afterwards. That's 5, his personal story. So the piece was seen by The Guardian as a success. It has toured 70 festivals around the world this year. It's gone to Cannes, Tribeca, Sundance. In October, the White House had an interactive festival, one-day festival, which it called South by South Lawn. And we built a cell which people could sit inside, a 6x9 cell, and watch the piece. And Valerie Jarrett, Obama's senior advisor, experienced the piece. That's a tweet by her, copying in common, who's next to her. Robert De Niro came and saw it at Tribeca and then went on to the Jimmy Fallon show afterwards, talking about the experience. It's had about 160,000 downloads. It's won awards last week. It won the Amnesty Media Awards. So it was seen as a success. I think it was also seen as a success in terms of storytelling as well, something that really used the medium well and told the story in a way that it hadn't been able to before. I mean, it's also, I think it's interesting when we're thinking about success of these projects who we're also trying to reach. So is it the policymaker, is it the Guardian reader, or is it a grassroots level? So the people who were previously incarcerated in solitary confinement now take out the cardboard goggles and show people when they're campaigning about trying to get rid of solitary confinement. They find it an incredibly useful tool to be able to show people what their experience was like. So as a kind of grassroots device, it's also useful. In October of this year, we launched Guardian VR Studio. So The Guardian wanted to continue to explore what virtual reality journalism looked like, and has set up a team of 6 people. We have a journalist, filmmaker, developer, someone from commercial, and a production manager, and I lead the team. And it's not only is it a multidisciplinary unit, it also crosses both commercial and editorial. The idea being not only to see how journalism looks like in VR, but also whether it's a sustainable activity as well. In early November, we launched Underworld. Now, this is an exploration under the streets of London in the Victorian sewer system. This was built in the late 19th century as Victorian slum London began to become so smelly that people were beginning to evacuate the city. Parliament was considering moving to Oxford or St Albans. It smelt so much on the River Thames. So this kind of very beautiful Victorian underground labyrinth of tunnels now exists. And Underworld takes you through this system, but you're guided by an urban explorer. Urban explorers are people who go into kind of forbidden spaces and explore. So I'll just play you. Can we have sound on this video as well, please? See if you can hear this. Oh. No? No? Okay. No?
Yes, okay.
Did you hear that? Shh.
Definitely can't hear it.
Welcome to the underworld. Nothing's off limits. You're in London's Victorian sewer system.
Right, I think we skipped that. You have to imagine it. You have to do the VR piece. Right. Don't worry.
Did you hear that? Shh. Over there in the alcove, there's a rat. Welcome to the underworld. Nothing's off limits. You're in London's Victorian sewer system. Doing this on your own would be very dangerous.
The underground is where the danger is.
You need to pay attention to There's a city within the city that we can find if we're willing to go out and explore it. Your batteries are going. There's an exit near here, a ladder up to the street. You need to find it. It's time to go.
So this is a lighter piece, but I think the idea of the VR department, as I see it, is to try and represent the range of journalism that we do at The Guardian. So everything from a feature to investigative reporting to life and style, the whole range really, but always trying to pick subjects that work suitably for virtual reality. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those are shortly. We also launched a range of other material again around Underworld, an interactive piece as well as interviews and podcasts to try and kind of complete the picture. So I'm going to now try and draw together some of the observations that we've found while making these pieces, and also through other virtual reality pieces of journalism that are out there. So some learnings, and also really bringing together why I think that it is a really interesting form of journalism. And this first one, presence, is really, really obvious. It transports you somewhere else, and this might sound really obvious, but it's actually really radical for journalism that we can place someone inside a story. You can feel you're tricked, it is a trick, but you can actually feel like you are in the place that we're writing about, that we're making films about, that we're making podcasts about, and that really changes your relationship to that story as well. The other is engagement. We spend our whole time reading emails, fielding text messages, WhatsApp messages, clicking to see what's new on the news while we're doing almost everything in our lives at the moment. And certainly at the moment, virtual reality is a form of journalism that doesn't allow that. You are absolutely immersed and engaged in that world. And it means that as journalists and as storytellers, we've got, it's enormously powerful to think that I can have someone's attention for, in 6x9's case, 9 minutes. And also memory. There's some really interesting research done that the way that we remember things is very much linked to space. We talk about spatial memory, and I'm sure you all know of the trick of the memory palace, where to remember complicated numbers or patterns, you put them in a place, in an imaginary place, round a palace, and it's a trick of trying to remember things. Also, the question, where were you when 9/11 happened, when JFK, it used to be when JFK was assassinated. We remember things very much spatially. So by having people's attention, by able to place them in a physical location, we can kind of emblaze things on people's memory in a different way. Some of the things that we need to consider moving forwards, and some of the specific points to VR journalism, I'm going to touch on now. And this is Noni de la Peña, who I was talking about earlier on with her Hunger in LA piece. She says, I think there's a generation gap between the gamers and non-gamers. It's really hard for the decision makers in the journalism field to come to terms with that, but it's going to be the gaming generation that's growing up that want to be informed global citizens. And it's really interesting to see how different news organizations and charities and documentary makers are approaching VR. And it's really different. If you look at what the New York Times is doing, it's very different from the Wall Street Journal, it's very different from the FT, it's very different from what we're doing, because there isn't really an established form yet. And I guess in terms of storytelling, which is what I know today is about, it's really exciting because the field is so open at the moment. What Noni is describing here is how journalism can be informed by gaming. And I think I agree with her here. I mean, we've talked for years about the gamification of news, and it's looked quite clunky over the years, where we've seen really literal kind of video games being, the techniques of that being kind of, with journalism being kind of crowbarred in often. And I think that's going to be the case, to be honest, with VR for a while. But I agree with Noni here that it's people who've got a good understanding of gaming who are going to be so useful in this area. How is it that being able to interact and engage with a virtual world, what does that mean with storytelling? And in our studio, I'm really keen that our developer, who comes from a kind of gaming background, is just as involved in terms of story development as our journalist and filmmaker are. They come at things from different perspectives, but actually, God, that's really where we should be at the moment in terms of developing this form. I think it's people who are in theatre, who are in interactive arts, who should be kind of contributing to where the form is going. Narrative is a really big challenge for us. If you have an interactive world that you're placing people in, what does that mean for narrative? What does it mean for character development? What does it mean for story arcs? This suddenly becomes utterly irrelevant here. This is what one of our storyboards look like for 6x9. You know, it's about where you move, what the spatial narrative of a piece is, rather than necessarily a story arc. We need to be considering that too. So quite a lot of pieces that you see are purely experiential. And I think what I see in the tech world, people at Google and Oculus, they like talking to the news organizations because we have such experience in terms of narrative and storytelling. But how do you match that up with something that's very experiential? A lot of pieces that you see are kind of, you put on the goggles and you can fly, or you can ski down a ski slope. But after about 30 seconds, you're quite bored of that because there is no narrative that holds you. So how do you bring narrative into something where you've got absolute free-form ability to look wherever you want, in terms of having characters who are playing out a narrative in front of you? That suddenly becomes very, very difficult. And also, this is something that I began to talk about recently when I've been doing this kind of speaking, is conflicting narratives. So many of our stories have got historical context. So if you're thinking about doing a piece, for instance, about migrants, about, this picture's taken in the Calais jungle, you need to know the backstory. But on the other hand, if you're in a place that is as visceral as this, telling someone's backstory in audio can just wash over you, because you're essentially telling two different stories. You've got a very strong visual story, and then you're trying to fill in backstories. Now, in film and in audio, and certainly in writing, it's easy to swap between past tense and present tense in different locations. It's very, very difficult here. So we are still trying to figure out what that actually means for telling complicated stories. Interaction. So this is something we talk about all the time in the studio. Can you do anything? If so, why? Are we just letting people perform an action because we can, because we want to give it a go, because we want to make people feel like they've got agency? Or is it actually going to help to make you feel engaged in the storyline? And interaction is actually really complicated. It means that you probably need to start building it in a game engine. It means that you need probably weeks of development time. So for 6x9, we had a device where you could look at different things in your cell and you could hear the story behind them in audio. It must have taken about 2 weeks to get that working, not because it was complicated to code, but because there is none of the user interaction language established yet. Each person who builds in an interaction is doing it for the first time. Even being able to navigate around the sewer system, which you would have thought would be so simple. Gamers have been dealing with navigation in space for years. Actually, in non-fiction context with a new bit of hardware was really complicated, and it took weeks to figure out how not to feel really sick. When you got really close to the edges of the tunnels, you felt absolutely awful. If you walked too slow, you felt really bored. If you went too fast, you felt like, why am I running through a sewer? So it just, even the smallest little bit of interaction needs a huge amount of iterating and work by developers, designers, and journalists. This is one of the most interesting parts in terms of storytelling in virtual reality, and one that I really, really want to explore. Why are you there? Like, we've transported you into this world, but why? And this is a table that I like to show people. So essentially, there are 4 different types of roles that you can have within virtual reality. So a ghost without impact, that is our most common one. That's a 360 video. That's probably like most of your New York Times pieces, which are filmed. You're not quite sure why you're there, but you're just peering in on someone else's story. Character with impact, that's basically your video game, where you are an avatar, you've got a character, and what you do is going to influence the outcome of that story. A ghost with impact, well, you haven't really got a role, but you can do stuff. And a character without impact, that is a bit like 6 by 9. You were the prisoner in the solitary confinement cell, but you really couldn't do very much. I mean, you could trigger stories of things around you, but you're not really going to influence your outcome. I'm afraid you're going to stay in the cell. And we thought about this a lot when we were building 6 by 9, and I remember having a conversation with Noni de la Peña, because we were discussing what a good approach to this would be. She discussed whether we should circle around the inmate. There's an argument that by looking them in the eyes, by seeing them, that you would empathize with them. I ended up really wanting to be that person, that actually you could have empathy even without seeing someone, because you would be in that cell seeing what they see every day and experiencing what they do. Audio is a huge, huge component of this. I mean, my background is in sound as a sound artist and radio producer, so I have a vested interest in this. But think about it, you can't really control the visuals where you look. So you can't tell somebody that to follow the story you have to look in this position. But with the audio, you can lay that narrative down. You can have a voiceover, you can have interviews, which will play regardless of where you look. The sound design, really? Wow, okay, I have to go really, really fast. The sound design is very, very important. We're working a lot on spatial sound design, so placing different sounds in the position, so that as you turn your head, it feels like that you're moving inside that world. Frontline really generously donated us the audio from a documentary that they made inside Maine Supermax prison, and I sound designed the whole of the space using real actuality, which also gave it the authenticity. So both the real interviews that we did, but also the real audio from Maine meant that it was, even though it was built in CGI, it was still really believable. Okay, I'm going to skip through those. On to challenges. Oh, you can't hear me. You can't hear me. Okay. Oh. Do you want me just to talk into it? Challenges. Quickly. Distraction. Even though I said that you were utterly immersed in your 360 environment, you're also inviting people to be distracted. You're saying, look wherever you want. That means that people's attention on your storyline or what you want them to look at might not happen. And in fact, research has shown, and actually we found this as well, building 6x9, is that people are so amazed by, wow, I'm in this virtual world, that they don't actually take in quite a lot of the audio that you're telling them. And actually we strip down and down and down the interviews, leaving nice spaces in between so that people actually had a chance to absorb. Now that might change as people get really used to these virtual worlds, but at the moment, if you overload people with information, they just will not take it in. Edits are really, really difficult. So far, the 2 pieces that we've made were in CGI, and there are no edits at all. But think about it in film. You film in one place, and then you cut to another place. It's like picking you up and throwing you into another universe. This is not a scene cut. This is cutting you from world to world. So far, people are just kind of fading to black and coming back into another place, but it's problematic. It's really unlike film, and it's more like theatre in terms of what your scene changes are or what your different acts are. It's expensive. The pieces that we've made are expensive because they're in CGI. Now, you can get relatively cheap 360 cameras, so it is definitely a sliding scale, but for this kind of ambition, it is definitely costly. Ethics. This is often a question for journalists. To film in 360, you have to hide, which means that your normal directors need to be well out of the scene. That often means that you have to be quite clear with the people that you're working with what needs to happen in that scene, which means a lot of pre-planning. Now, documentary makers, we're quite used to that. We're quite used to kind of figuring out what that scene is. But really, this level of preparation and directing of scenes has been questioned about its authenticity as kind of pure journalism and pure documentary making. Also, its effect on its audience as well. Our managing director and I had long talks about the ethics of exposing people to such a strong experience as 6x9 and the kind of warnings that needed to come around it, what age it was suitable for. Bad content. We're all experimenting, and all of the pieces, I would say, that are out there at the moment are prototypes. It's an exciting period because of that, but it's also a challenge for the industry, because if we don't develop our story-making skills quick enough, then the form will die again. And it's actually our responsibility not to be making bad content. Money. How do you raise money for pieces, whether it's from commercial organizations or getting money for grants, for works that have quite a small reach? Even with the cardboard headsets, this is a much smaller audience than a written piece of journalism or a film that you can stick up on YouTube or Vimeo. I think that might be it. The future. So is it all hype? Is there a future here in VR? I mean, I believe so, because I think it's such a strong form that I can't really imagine that it won't develop into something. And quite a lot of the questions that I get asked are, what is it going to look like in 5 years? What are the headsets going to look like? I absolutely don't know, but I definitely know that the really clunky headsets that you saw at the beginning are not going to be the future. It needs to be integrated into our technology. So, I mean, you're already using your mobile phone in the headset, but it needs to be so integrated in the way that our email, our cameras, our text messaging, all is in our phone. It needs to be so simple that it kind of layers, the virtual reality layers itself into our worlds. Now, I don't think that's going to happen next year, but I really hope that the technology and the content develops so that we do get there. And I believe that it will do. This is my details. This is our Guardian VR studio address if you want to send us any emails. Thank you.
Francesca, your great talk inspired many questions. You answered some of them. You already mentioned it's very time-consuming to produce content like this.
Yep.
You also said it's very costly.
Yep.
Could you be maybe, if it's not a secret, more concrete? How was the budget for 6x9 project?
I mean, 6x9, there was so many kind of partnerships that it's hard to cost it up exactly. So we worked with a visual effects company that thought it was a great story, So, you know, it was a co-production with them. Frontline gave us their actuality, so it's really hard to cost that up in absolute terms. But it would be a really, really expensive project. Anything in CGI is going to be costly.
Okay.
Filming is much less problematic.
Okay, we can imagine. How much time of a day do you spend in the virtual reality? I think the question with almost most likes.
Actually, I spend quite a lot of time in reality.
Okay, and the most popular question from Anonymous, in what time do you think VR will be widely available in the education? Now, after Brexit, maybe just in the UK?
Oh. Sore point. I mean, it's being used in education at the moment, so I think it's a question of kind of, you know, how fast the content is developed for that, and that, you know, the headsets get out into schools.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You mentioned the ethics. There's a question about what is your opinion to overloading of information, especially if shared in ways as VR that works with emotions?
Well, I mean, I feel... So sometimes people talk about the ethics of VR in terms of it being overly emotive and its use as propaganda. I mean, I personally feel they're the same ethics as any media. They've all got potential for that. And I don't think that VR is necessarily a more empathetic medium than other pieces. I've seen lots of really unempathetic VR pieces, because we're still experimenting, as I said, and like a really strong bit of written journalism has got far more power for empathy. So I think it is a journalist's responsibility, or a documentary maker's responsibility, to toe that line in terms of what its relationship with the audience is.
Mm-hmm. Francesca, when I saw your piece on underground London, I immediately saw it on a novel, Neverwhere, by Neil Gaiman, which basically the young hero is entering the underground London, and the whole book is basically happening in these tunnels. Mm-hmm. So can you imagine, you mentioned journalism for VR. Are there any, or can you imagine a literary piece written for VR?
But yeah, so I'm exploring that at the moment, working with our literary editor for, you know, what... we're looking for commissioning pieces that would have journalistic angles, but I think that fiction is like such an interesting form for virtual reality, and I'm sure that those working, you know, within fiction publications will be doing that at the moment. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this was a good example for power of storytelling. Thank you for coming to Bratislava. Thank you very much, Francesca Panetta from Guardian, and thank you for all the questions.